Kids need a father. I hadn't spoken to my father in over 30 years. Our last conversation had ended in a hate-filled, violent argument, and after that, he vanished from my life completely. So when the lawyer's letter arrived, informing me that my estranged father had passed away and left his entire estate to me, I was numb. I didn't even know where he had lived or if he was even still alive. The address on the letter led me to a small rural neighborhood a few states over. I hadn't heard of the place before, and something about it felt off. I quickly searched the address online, finding little more than a few scattered listings for nearby homes and some articles mentioning the area's history of abandonment. It didn't look like the kind of place anyone would want to live, let alone die. I stared at it for a long time, my thoughts tangled. I wasn't sure if I should even go. After all, this was a man who had never wanted me in his life. Yet, something about the letter made me feel like I couldn't ignore it. I needed to take care of things, close the door on this chapter of my life, whatever it meant. I hesitated, torn between the idea of making arrangements to take a week off work and the discomfort of even stepping foot near the house. Taking time off felt like the responsible thing to do, but I couldn't shake the anxiety that came with having to deal with this alone. Finally, I called in and told them I'd be gone for the week. I packed a bag nervously, unsure of what I would find when I arrived. 2 days later, I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. No matter how hard I tried to focus on work or keep my mind occupied, thoughts of my father kept creeping back in. I wondered what kind of man he had been in those final years. Had he changed? Had he ever thought about me? The unanswered questions gnawed at me, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore them, the weight of his absence seemed to hang over me, pulling me under. The morning of the trip arrived, and I found myself sitting in the airport 3 hours before my flight, my nerves a tangled mess. I kept staring at the boarding gate, wishing I could somehow escape the overwhelming sense of dread building inside me. It felt like I was preparing to step into some unknown territory, not just physically, but emotionally. I wasn't sure if I was ready to confront the father I had long since written off or the secrets he'd left behind. The flight seemed too far away, but I couldn't bring myself to leave, couldn't bring myself to turn back either. When it was finally time to board the flight, I stood up from my seat, feeling a sudden rush of cold anxiety flood through me. As I walked toward the gate, I glanced back at the terminal, a fleeting thought creeping into my mind. What if I just didn't go? What if I turned around, went home, and left the past buried where it belonged? The thought almost felt like a lifeline, a way to avoid whatever nightmare awaited me at that house. But as quickly as the thought surfaced, I squashed it down, reminding myself that I had no choice but to face what was waiting. I had to know what my father had left me, and perhaps more importantly, why. With a deep breath, I stepped onto the plane, the doors closing behind me, sealing my fate. The flight seemed to drag on, the minutes stretching longer than they should have. When we finally landed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was stepping into a place I wasn't meant to be. The small airport was quiet, the air humid and thick with an unfamiliar weight. After picking up my bag, I headed to the rental car counter, where the agent handed me the keys with a friendly smile and a hope you have a good stay. The car was a nondescript sedan, nothing special, but it felt like a small comfort in the sea of unfamiliarity around me. I checked into the hotel shortly after, the lobby dark and empty. The receptionist gave me a polite smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. She handed me the room key, and I numbly made my way upstairs, letting myself into the room. I dropped my bag on the bed and glanced around at the sterile, lifeless decor. For a moment, I thought about sitting down to gather my thoughts, but the tension in my chest only grew tighter. I couldn't bring myself to eat lunch. The thought of food made me feel queasy, the anxiety twisting in my stomach. I couldn't focus on anything other than the house that waited for me. After 20 minutes of settling, I made my way downstairs again, knowing I would have to get some drinks and food to nibble on before I hunkered down for the night. The drive and normality of trying to eat felt like the bare minimum I could do to keep myself functioning. I needed to keep my mind distracted, to keep myself from unraveling with the fear of what lay ahead. Returning to my hotel room, I set the bag of gas station food on the small table and stared at the contents for a moment. The thought of forcing down food seemed impossible, but I knew I had to try. Yet everything about this trip, this moment, felt suffocating, like I was on the verge of something I couldn't escape. Dinner would have to wait. For now, I just needed to sleep, if only to prepare myself for what was coming next. The next morning, I woke up early, the weight of the day ahead pressing down on me. I didn't want to wait any longer. I had to see the house now. With a stomach churning in anxiety, I drove to the address. I pulled up in front of the house as the first light of day began to break over the horizon. It felt wrong. The house was eerily quiet, the yard overgrown, the windows dark and untouched by time. The place looked abandoned, and yet it was unmistakably the house I had come to claim. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. I was here. I had to do this. Inside, the house was just as depressing as it had looked from the outside. Dust clung to the furniture, the air stale and thick with disuse. I moved through the rooms carefully, opening cabinets, drawers, anything I could think to search, but nothing out of the ordinary jumped out at me. For a moment, I thought I had been wrong about everything, that maybe this was just a mistake, a strange coincidence. But then I entered the kitchen, and that's when I saw it. A narrow door, cleverly hidden behind the wooden paneling, nearly invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. I had no idea what was behind it, but my instincts screamed that I needed to know. My heart raced as I hesitated, but my curiosity pushed me forward. I was smart enough to know not to go into a dark room behind a hidden door in any house, especially one like this, where everything felt off. But I also wasn't foolish enough to head into a potentially dangerous situation without being prepared. I had a concealed carry permit and never went anywhere without my firearm. There wasn't an issue with bringing it along. I had stored it under the plane for the flight, and upon landing, placed it safely in the trunk of the rental car. I quickly turned back to the car and retrieved my 4th-generation Austrian 9 pistol and a flashlight, knowing full well I needed both to feel remotely safe. The flashlight flickered to life, casting a narrow beam of light as I made my way back toward the house. The hidden room waited, and I was ready to confront whatever it held. The room beyond was small, no more than a jail cell in size. I stepped in, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. My eyes adjusted slowly, revealing a narrow staircase that led down further into the house. As I descended the steps, the smell of mildew and something else, something metallic, filled my nostrils. At the bottom, the beam of my flashlight fell on something that sent a chill running down my spine. What looked like boxes of documents lined the walls, surrounding a circle of numerous arranged stands, every one displaying a wig. They sat like trophies, each placed with meticulous care. But then I froze. My gaze landed on the last wig in the room, which stood out among the others. It was bleach blonde, the tips dyed red. My stomach churned as I realized what I was seeing. It was unmistakable. I knew that hair. I've seen that hair. It was my ex-girlfriend's hair, the one who had gone missing over 10 years ago. The one I had never been able to forget. The one who had vanished without a trace, just like my father. This couldn't be a coincidence. My mind reeled as the room seemed to close in around me. I felt sick to my core, an icy tingle crawling up my spine. I had to get out. I turned and ran back upstairs, my thoughts a blur as I dialed the police, my hands shaking. When they arrived, I was still outside, shaking, waiting, praying that they would know what to do. The officers moved in quickly, their presence bringing some measure of comfort, but the horror of what I had just discovered lingered. After an hour of investigation and forensic examination, they came back to me with chilling news. The wigs, every single one of them, belonged to women who had gone missing across many states over the past 30 years. The lead officer, his face grim, turned to me and said, "We can't tie it all together yet, but we think we're dealing with a serial killer." The house, the wigs, my father, everything I thought I knew had been a lie. My father wasn't just some estranged man. He had been part of something much darker than I could have ever imagined. And now, I was stuck in the middle of it. In the weeks that followed, I found myself trapped in a waking nightmare, unable to escape the gravity of what had been uncovered. The investigation into my father's twisted legacy had been exhaustive, but the truth was even darker than I could have imagined. The women, those missing for decades, had all been reported missing within a 75-mile radius of wherever I had been living. I'm 45 now, and in those 30 years since I last saw my father, I have lived in 8 different states. Yet no matter how far I went, no matter how many different lives I tried to build, my father had always been closer than I realized. The investigators, piecing together everything they could from the hidden room I had discovered, came to a chilling conclusion. My father had been following me. The file boxes in that dark room were filled with documents, photographs, and videos that chronicled his every move, proof that he had been near, watching, waiting. In each box, there were disturbing images of the victims, but worse still, some of those photographs and videos included me, always in the background, just out of focus, as if I was never meant to notice. As a teenager, a young adult, with my ex, I had unwittingly walked past the traces of my father's presence without knowing. My father had filmed me at different points in my life, moments I had long forgotten, family vacations, birthday parties, even casual outings. Only now, I could see his eyes on me from the shadows, always lingering, always close, his watchful eyes capturing my every move. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I realized how long he had been stalking me, quietly ensuring that I was always within his reach. My whole life, I had been surrounded by him, and I never even knew it. In the countless hours that I spent working with the detectives, piecing together the nightmare of my father's secret life, I could only think about how I had never truly escaped him. All these years, I had assumed that the distance between us, the different places I had lived, the new identities I had built for myself, meant that I was free. But my father had never let me go. I still don't know how to process everything. How do you make sense of a lifetime of lies and horror? How do you go back to a life that now feels entirely hollow? Every day since this began, I've felt a mixture of disbelief and dread. The faces of the victims, those women who had vanished in the shadows of my father's world, haunt me. I've since left the investigation and all of its secrets behind me, the shadows of my father's legacy lingering in my every thought. In the time since, I made one final move, relocating to a remote corner of the world where no one knows my name and nothing connects me to the life I once had. There's a sense of peace in the isolation, a silence that allows me to finally breathe without looking over my shoulder. I have no intention of ever contacting anyone I knew before. They remain buried in the past, just like the life I used to live. But now I'm left with the inescapable truth. He will always be watching.